The sky was still dark when Mia stepped into the terminal, her uniform freshly pressed, her coffee untouched in her hand, and her mind already counting the hours until landing. She had worked this route dozens of times, Los Angeles to New York non-stop, and usually full of regular business flyers and the occasional celebrity hiding behind sunglasses and silence. But today the energy in the air felt different, like the kind of tension before a thunderstorm, when everything goes too still and your instincts start whispering without saying why. She walked past gate 37, nodding at the crew waiting on standby, her heels clicking on the cold floor, the kind of sound you only notice when everything else has gone quiet. And yet she felt eyes on her, not one person, not two, but many, like the feeling when you enter a room and know something is about to happen, but you have no proof and no way to prepare. Boarding began on time, the usual rush of passengers ignoring their zones, talking too loudly, fumbling with oversized carry-ons, and barely glancing at the attendants who greeted them like ghosts in the system scene, but rarely noticed. Maya smiled anyway, her years of training turning her face into a mask of warmth and efficiency, no matter how tired or uneasy she felt. Then she saw her Layla Hart, the influencer whose face had been everywhere the last 2 years, luxury travel lifestyle fitness fame, built on filters and flights and followers, millions of them. And as she walked up the jet bridge with a phone in one hand and her designer tote in the other, Maya knew exactly what was coming. Layla barely made eye contact, but her phone was pointed straight ahead as she filmed her entry, already talking to her audience, and Maya slipped into her polished customer service mode, offering her a surprise upgrade to business class, a gesture the airline encouraged. When big names flew economy, it was good publicity, free marketing. And Layla was already smiling at her screen, calling the airline classy, calling the crew amazing, while never once saying Maya's name. She waved her through and turned back to the line, her eyes landing on a man near the back of the boarding group, older, maybe in his late 60s, dressed plainly in a dark blue windbreaker with a simple black duffel in one hand and an unreadable expression on his face. He looked around with quiet eyes, not suspicious, not nervous, just observant, like someone who had seen everything and expected nothing. Mia scanned his ticket, absent-mindedly gave him the same smile she gave every unremarkable passenger, and he nodded once without a word, walking past her like a shadow blending into the crowd. Something about him stayed in her mind, not alarming, not strange, just different. But the moment passed quickly as more passengers arrived, more greetings, more chaos, more upgrades to process, and by the time the last boarding call echoed through the terminal, she had already forgotten about the man in the blue jacket. But she would remember him soon, much sooner than she ever expected. The cabin lights dimmed as the final passengers settled into their seats, and the engines began to hum with that low, steady rhythm that always made Maya feel both calm and alert, like a warning hidden in comfort. The crew did their safety checks with mechanical precision, but her mind was somewhere else, still stuck on two faces, one overly familiar, the other oddly forgettable. Layla Hart was already taking photos of the champagne glass in her hand, one foot tucked under her, as if she were lounging at home instead of 30,000 feet in the air. She smiled at her phone, more than she had at any human that morning. Her voice carried down the aisle as she narrated her first-class upgrade, like it was a divine reward, not a calculated move by an airline hoping for social media mentions. Meanwhile, the man in the blue windbreaker sat quietly near the rear of the plane, barely moving, barely blinking. He had not asked for anything, not even water, and yet Mia had noticed that he had not removed his jacket, not unzipped his bag, not reached for a phone, or even closed his eyes. His presence was still and unnerving, not in a threatening way, but in the kind of way that made you keep checking the same door twice. The flight climbed smoothly above the clouds, leaving Los Angeles behind, as the cabin grew silent aside from a few scattered conversations and the occasional ding of a call button. Mia moved through the aisles, checking belts, answering questions, offering smiles, but she kept catching herself glancing toward the back and wondering what it was about him that had left a mark on her memory so quickly. He had done nothing, she reminded herself again and again, no odd movements, no strange requests, just silence. But silence itself can be loud, especially when everyone else is trying so hard to be seen and heard and remembered. Halfway through the flight, turbulence began, nothing serious, just enough to make glasses rattle and hearts, pause the kind that made everyone hold on to their armrests for a few seconds before pretending they were fine again. Mia steadied herself, then moved to reassure a nervous passenger near the middle of the cabin when her earpiece crackled to life, and the captain's voice came through low and tense, asking her to report to the cockpit immediately. Her stomach tightened. The tone in his voice was different, not urgent, but heavy and deliberate, like someone choosing every word with care. She made her way forward, weaving through the aisles past passengers, lost in movies or books or quiet thoughts. And when she reached the cockpit, the door opened without a word. Inside, the captain handed her a printed page marked with a red stamp. She read the words once, then again, slower each time. An unnamed federal judge was on board, traveling under protection. No announcement, no attention. Ensure safety and discretion at all costs. The paper included a photo, and Maya's breath caught in her throat. It was him. The man in the blue windbreaker. The one she had ignored. The one she had almost forgotten. Until now. Mia stepped out of the cockpit, gripping the printed alert in her hand, her fingers trembling just enough to feel it, but not enough to show it to the passengers moving past her in slow waves of indifference. She walked like her shoes weighed more than they did her mind, racing through every training scenario she had learned over the years, none of them feeling quite right for this. The man was a federal judge. That fact alone was enough to make her cautious, but it was the reason behind his travel that kept echoing in her thoughts. The words had been vague, but heavy enough to drag her into a silent, panic, high-profile case. Multiple threats, increased risk of exposure, and above all, no one could know he was on board. Mia paused by the galley, her breath shallow. The curtains separating business class from economy suddenly felt like more than fabric. It felt like a mistake, one she had made, without knowing, one that now had weight, consequences, meaning. She glanced toward Layla, who was now laughing with a young man in the next seat, showing him something on her phone, her voice just loud enough to be annoying, and just practiced enough to be performative. It was all a show, and Mia had played right into it, offering her the seat, the champagne, the attention. And then she looked toward the back of the cabin. There he was, the man in the windbreaker, still unmoving, still silent, still watching without watching, like someone used to seeing more than he let on, his hands folded over his lap, his eyes slowly scanning the cabin as if he was memorizing every face, every detail, every exit. She had no idea what he knew, or what he expected, or if he had already seen something that she had missed. She made her way toward him, steady and slow, her mind rehearsing what to say but coming up with nothing that felt natural, because how do you speak to someone who is pretending to be invisible when you are the one who failed to see him in the first place? When she reached his row, she leaned slightly and whispered just enough for him to hear. "Sir, if there is anything you need, please let me know immediately." His head turned, and for the first time their eyes met in full, and it felt like someone had flipped a switch in a dark room. He did not smile, he did not speak, he only nodded, once with a look that said more than words ever could, a look that told her he knew that she knew now. She stood there for a second longer than she should have before moving on, but as she did, she noticed something she had missed before. There was a man 2 rows behind him, pretending to sleep. But his eyes were barely closed, and his posture was too stiff. And Maya knew, without needing to check the manifest, that he had not boarded through the front. Something else was going on, something layered, something deeper. and the flight was only halfway through. The hum of the engines grew louder, though nothing had changed, except Maya's heartbeat, which felt too fast for a routine flight. She walked back toward the galley, poured herself a cup of water she didn't drink, and tried to slow her breathing just enough to think clearly. The man in the windbreaker was no longer just another quiet passenger. Now he was a name on a federal watch list now. He was someone people wanted to silence, and she was responsible for making sure no one even noticed he was there. She glanced down the aisle again and caught the man 2 rows back, shifting slightly, not much, just enough to confirm what she had suspected. His eyes were open, just a sliver watching the judge, but pretending to nap. His shoes were polished black like military issue, his jacket zipped just high enough to hide a communication wire, and he had the posture of someone trained to react in less than a second. He was not a threat, Maya realized, but a shadow meant to follow, without being seen, one of the silent watchers sent to keep the judge alive. And if one was visible, that meant another was likely hidden, and suddenly every face on the plane looked different. She moved through the cabin slowly this time, watching everyone more closely than before. An elderly couple sharing peanuts, a teenager watching a movie with headphones, too loud, a man with sunglasses on indoors pretending to read a newspaper, all of them normal, and yet her mind refused to rest. In business class, Layla was now fully reclined, phone still in hand, as she scrolled through comments on a post she had uploaded midair, despite the no Wi-Fi sign, and Mia had no idea how she had managed that, but she had no time to care. The seatbelt sign lit up without warning, and the plane jolted just enough to make drinks spill and heads turn. The captain's voice came over the speaker, calm but firm. "Flight attendants, please secure the cabin immediately." It was routine, or at least it sounded routine, but something in the tone made Maya move faster than usual. As she passed row 28, a young man near the window stood up too quickly, bumping into the passenger beside him, his hands fumbling with the overhead bin. Maya turned to speak, but paused. There was nothing in the compartment above him. He was not reaching for a bag. He was stalling. He looked back over his shoulder toward the rear of the plane, then sat down again, his body tense, his hands clenched in his lap, his eyes now fixed on the judge. Maya's stomach turned, and she moved to the back galley, pretending to check supplies, while quietly reaching for the intercom used only for crew communication. She pressed the button, her voice low. "This is lead flight attendant. We may have a situation developing." No response came immediately, and the silence felt longer than the flight itself. She stared down the aisle, watching the judge, watching the man pretending not to. And in that moment she knew this flight was no longer about customer service. It was about survival. Mia's hand shook as she slowly released the intercom button, her pulse thumping in her ears. She looked up toward the front of the cabin, hoping for a signal from the cockpit, hoping that the captain had heard her. But nothing came back, just the low drone of the engines and the hum of quiet passengers. The man pretending to sleep was still watching the judge. Maya had no doubt now that he wasn't just a passenger. He was a guard, a silent bodyguard, meant to protect the man who sat so still at the back. But she knew that if he was there, then others were too. Her mind raced as she turned back to the galley and tried to keep her breathing steady, but something about this felt wrong, felt off, and the air inside the plane seemed too thick, as if it were closing in on her. Maya stepped into the small service area, pulling out the drink cart and slowly pushing it down the aisle, her eyes scanning every row for any signs of movement that didn't fit in. The turbulence hadn't stopped, it had gotten worse, and she felt the plane dip sharply, as if something was shifting just under the surface, as if they were no longer alone up here in the sky. As she passed row 28 again, she saw the young man still pretending to sleep, his eyes barely closed, and his body tensed as though he were waiting for something. She paused briefly, watching him closely, his posture still too stiff, the way he shifted his hands in his lap, the way his fingers were pressed tightly together, as though ready to spring at any moment. Then Mia noticed something even worse. The man in the blue windbreaker, the judge, had shifted in his seat, just slightly, and now his eyes were locked on the young man, 2 rows ahead of him, their gazes meeting in a brief but deliberate moment of connection. Maya's breath caught in her throat, and before she could think about it, she moved toward the young man, and the judge instinctively her feet carrying her closer to the danger without knowing why. When she was just a few steps away, she heard a low but distinct click that could have been mistaken for the sound of a seatbelt fastening, but Mia knew better than that. Her eyes darted toward the back of the cabin, and in that split second, she saw a second figure standing near the emergency exit at the rear of the plane. The figure was cloaked in a dark jacket hood pulled low, but Mia could make out the faint outline of something metallic under his arm, a weapon hidden in plain sight, and it was aimed at the judge. Her heart stopped, her mind screamed at her to do something, but her body refused to move. She couldn't act too fast, not without knowing who else might be involved. Mia grabbed the nearest overhead compartment and yanked it open, pretending to reach for a blanket, but instead her eyes scanned the cabin for more threats. The second figure near the exit took a step toward the aisle, his body tense, his eyes flicking toward the young man in row 28, then toward the judge, and Mia knew instantly they were all in on it. This wasn't just an assassination attempt. It was a coordinated strike, and she was caught in the middle of it. Mia's heart raced as the figure by the emergency exit moved forward, his steps quiet but deliberate, and she knew she couldn't wait any longer. She had to act. But how could she make a move without alerting everyone else, without making it worse? She glanced toward the cockpit, where the captain was probably already alerted, but the security threat was here now. It was real, it was happening. And she was the only one who could stop it. Maya's eyes flicked toward the young man, still pretending to sleep, his fingers still curled tight, his entire body stiff as a board, as if every part of him was waiting for a signal. And in that moment she knew what she had to do. She took a slow step toward him, her hand gripping the drink cart, as if nothing was wrong, but every instinct screamed at her to act faster, to scream, to make a noise. But she kept her cool for the moment, her eyes never leaving the young man. When she was close enough to feel his body heat, she leaned in just enough to whisper in his ear, "Your cover is blown," and she watched his eyes snap open, his pupils darkening, as if the words had triggered something she hadn't expected. He moved so quickly, it was a blur, his hands shooting up and grabbing her wrist, before she could pull back his grip tight, and cold like metal, he whispered fiercely, "Don't do anything stupid," and for the first time she heard fear in his voice. Before Mia could react, the man in the blue windbreaker stood up, and the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. The sound of his seatbelt releasing was louder than it should have been, and all at once Mia knew this wasn't an accident. This wasn't just a coincidence. The judge was no longer a victim, he was part of it too. His eyes locked with hers, and for a split second Maya saw something in his gaze, something calculating, something that told her he knew exactly what was going on, and had known it for longer than she ever could. Maya didn't hesitate. She twisted her wrist out of the young man's grip and pushed the cart toward him. Using the moment of distraction to move faster, she reached for the intercom button again, this time her finger pressing down hard, a command in her mind to send out the signal to the cockpit. But the second she did, the lights flickered, and the cabin fell into darkness. A wave of panic rippled through the passengers, gasps of surprise, murmurs of confusion, people reaching for their phones. But the only light now was from the emergency exit signs glowing dim red in the corners of the plane. Mia had a sharp breath behind her, and then the unmistakable sound of someone moving swiftly across the aisle, someone heading straight for the cockpit. She spun around, her heart in her throat, just in time to see the figure by the emergency exit make his move, running for the front. The young man was right behind him. And now Mia knew the truth. They weren't after the judge. They were after the flight itself. The plane shook again, this time harder, the lights flickering on and off. Like a warning, the sudden jolt sent a few passengers gasping and grabbing at their seats, but Mia barely noticed her eyes locked on the figure running toward the cockpit, the young man from row 28, right behind him, both of them moving like shadows in the chaos. Maya's mind raced. She had to stop them, but how when every part of the cabin seemed like a trap, when every aisle seemed like it could hide more enemies than she could count? She couldn't let them reach the cockpit, not with whatever they were planning, not when the lives of everyone on board were at risk. She took a breath, steeling herself, and moved quickly toward the rear of the plane, where the emergency exit was still glowing dimly red. She needed to get to the galley, get the phone hidden behind the counter, the one that was still connected to the ground communication system, the one she was trained never to use unless there was a real emergency. But Maya knew this was as real as it gets. She turned and began walking down the aisle, keeping her back against the seats, her eyes on the emergency door, and her senses alert to every sound, every movement. She couldn't make a sound, not yet. She needed to be invisible. The young man and the other figure were almost to the cockpit now, and Maya's stomach dropped as she saw them both move into position outside the door. The first figure, the one in the dark jacket, was standing guard, blocking the narrow aisle, while the young man pulled out something from under his coat. It was a gun. Maya froze in place, the world narrowing down to that one sight, the cold metal gleaming in the dim light, the reality of the situation crashing into her chest, like a wave too strong to push back, and for a moment she thought she might be too late. But then the gunman looked over his shoulder for just a fraction of a second, and that was all the opening Mia needed. Without thinking, she pushed herself off the wall and sprinted forward toward the galley, hoping the noise of her feet pounding against the floor wouldn't give her away. She reached the galley just as the gunman turned back to the cockpit, his attention focused forward, and Mia grabbed the phone, pulling it out of the hidden compartment. She pressed the emergency button without hesitation, sending a signal to the control tower below. She had no time to explain, no time to give a full report, just a single sentence into the receiver: "There are hijackers on board, send help." The phone went dead almost instantly, the line cut off, and Maya's heart skipped a beat. But she didn't waste time wondering if the message was received. She slammed the phone back into the compartment and turned back toward the cabin. The lights flickered again, only this time they didn't come back on. They stayed off the cabin, filled with darkness, and a low hum of the engines, the silence pressing in like a heavy blanket. And then the loudest sound broke through the stillness: a gunshot. It came from the front of the plane, the sharp crack of metal on metal, followed by a shout and the distinct sound of chaos exploding in the cockpit. Maya's breath caught in her throat. She had seconds, maybe less. The plane lurched again, this time harder than before, the sharp noise of the gunshot still ringing in Mia's ears. The chaos from the cockpit spilling into the cabin. Passengers were starting to panic, murmurs spreading like wildfire, confusion spreading faster than the fire could be contained. Maya's heart was pounding in her chest, her eyes darting from the cockpit to the emergency exit, the aisle, the overhead compartments, where shadows seemed to be moving without making a sound. She had seconds, if that. Maya's body moved without thinking. She ducked low, sliding behind a row of seats to stay out of sight of the gunman, and the second figure now moving down the aisle toward the cockpit to join the other assailant. She glanced around the cabin. There was nowhere to hide, no safe place to run, and the walls felt like they were closing in around her as the plane rocked violently again. A scream cut through the air. A woman in the back of the cabin had started to cry out, her voice trembling and filled with panic, and Mia knew that if she didn't act now, chaos would take over, and the hijackers would have full control. She needed a plan. In the back galley, Maya spotted a fire extinguisher mounted against the wall. It wasn't much, but it was something, and as she crawled toward it, the sound of footsteps approaching from the front of the plane made her freeze. A figure passed by just inches from her hiding spot. It was the young man from earlier, the one who had been pretending to sleep, his eyes locked straight ahead, his face cold, and determined. Mia held her breath, and remained still, not daring to make a sound she couldn't risk being seen. Not now. The footsteps moved further down the aisle, and Mia saw her chance. She grabbed the fire extinguisher and stood quickly, her fingers tight around the handle. As she moved toward the cockpit, her eyes focused on the front of the plane, where she knew the gunmen were already preparing for whatever they had planned next. She reached the cockpit door and paused for just a moment. The handle was locked, and the thought crossed her mind that maybe she wasn't meant to get in there. Maybe this was someone else's fight. But Maya's hands were shaking as she gripped the fire extinguisher, and with one forceful swing slammed it into the door. With all her strength, the lock gave way, and the door cracked open just enough for her to slip inside. The cockpit was a mess. The captain and co-pilot were on the floor, barely conscious, their seat belts tangled around them, both bloods staining the uniforms. Maya's stomach twisted with the sight. But there was no time to waste. She turned quickly and slammed the door shut behind her, locking it as best as she could. The two hijackers were just outside the door, and Maya knew she had no more time to hesitate. She grabbed the radio, the emergency one she had seen the captain use earlier, and pressed it to her lips, her voice steady but urgent. "This is lead flight attendant. I need immediate assistance. We are under attack, and there are multiple hijackers on board." Her finger hovered over the button for a moment. As she listened to the chaos unfolding outside the door, she heard a voice coming from the other side, muffled and low but unmistakable. It was the judge. He wasn't a victim anymore. He was the mastermind of it all. And just like that, Mia knew she had to make a choice. She could fight and risk everything, or she could wait for help to arrive. But she couldn't wait any longer. The plane was descending. And it wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about saving everyone on board.